Sometimes a single moment can change the entire course of a life. For Jesse Hart, that moment came with a kiss that made an entire town go silent. He was just a drifting cowboy who stepped in to help a young woman in trouble at a Bitter Ridge saloon. But small-town justice demanded payment. He had to marry Clara Bell to save her honor. Jesse laughed it off until the mayor's bold daughter grabbed him by the collar and kissed him in front of everyone. What he didn't know was that Clara's mother was the woman he'd once loved and lost. Can any man outrun his past when it's wrapped in the arms of a woman who won't let go? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Bitter Ridge in shades of amber and dust, the kind of light that made everything look both harsh and beautiful at the same time. Jesse Hart had been watching these sunrises for 3 weeks now, and each one reminded him why he kept moving. Towns like this had a way of settling into your bones if you let them, and Jesse had learned long ago not to let anywhere feel too much like home. He stood in the doorway of Miller's General Store, coffee mug warming his calloused hands, watching the town wake up. The street below was already busy. Freight wagons rolling in from the valley, storekeepers sweeping their boardwalks, women in long skirts hurrying toward the market with baskets hooked over their arms. It was a scene he'd witnessed in a dozen towns across Montana, Wyoming, and now here in the Dakota Territory. Same rhythms, different faces, always the same longing for something he couldn't quite name. His room sat above the general store, a simple affair with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over Main Street. The rent was cheap because Mrs. Miller, the shopkeeper's widow, liked having someone in the building at night. Jesse didn't mind. He'd slept in far worse places. Line shacks during blizzards, under bridges when money ran thin. Once in a barn with a temperamental mule that kicked him twice before dawn. The worn saddle leaning against the wall near his bed was the only possession he truly cared about. Hand-tooled leather darkened by years of weather and sweat, with initials carved into the cantle, J.H. His father had given it to him when he turned 16, back when Jesse still believed the world held clear paths and certain futures. The saddle had outlasted every other dream he'd carried since then. It was scarred, patched in places, the stirrups replaced twice over. But it fit him like it had grown there, shaped by his weight and his wandering. Jesse finished his coffee and headed down the back stairs, avoiding Mrs. Miller and her habit of asking personal questions. The morning air carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills and wood smoke from breakfast fires. Bitter Ridge sat in a valley cupped by low mountains, the kind of country that looked gentle from a distance but could kill you if you weren't paying attention. Winters here were brutal, summers blistering, and the people who stayed were either too stubborn or too rooted to imagine living anywhere else. The lumber mill stood at the edge of town, near where Bitter Creek cut through the valley on its way to join the Missouri River 20 miles south. Jesse had found work there his second day in town, no questions asked beyond whether he could handle a saw and show up on time. The pay was decent, the work honest, and old Ben, the foreman, had the good sense not to pry into a man's history. Ben was already at the mill when Jesse arrived, checking the water levels in the pond where the logs floated, waiting to be pulled onto the carriages. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with hands like tree bark and a way of squinting at the world that suggested he'd seen most of what it had to offer and wasn't particularly impressed. "Morning." "Jesse," Ben called out, not looking up from his inspection. "We got a big order from the Bell Ranch. Going to need you on the planer today." "Sure thing." Jesse grabbed his work gloves from the hook near the main building. "How big an order?" "Enough to keep us busy through next week. Mayor Bell's building a new barn, wants everything finished before winter." Ben finally looked at Jesse, his gray eyes assessing. "You thinking of staying past the season?" It was the closest Ben had come to asking Jesse about his plans. In 3 weeks, they'd developed a rhythm of work and silence that suited them both. "Haven't decided yet," Jesse said, which was the truth. He never decided until the morning he saddled his horse and rode out. Planning ahead felt too much like making promises he couldn't keep. Ben nodded, accepting this. Fair enough. Man's got a right to his own counsel. The workday settled into its familiar pattern, the scream of the saws, the smell of fresh-cut pine, the steady accumulation of sawdust on his clothes and in his hair. Jesse liked the physicality of it, the way his body knew what to do without his mind getting involved. His hands guided the boards through the planer, his muscles adjusted to the weight and grain of the wood, and for hours at a time, he didn't think about where he'd been or where he was going. During the lunch break, Jesse sat with some of the other mill hands on the loading dock, eating the sandwich Mrs. Miller had sold him that morning. The men talked about the usual things: weather, work, women, whiskey. Jesse listened more than he spoke, a habit he'd developed over years of being the new man in town. "You hear about the mayor's daughter?" One of the younger workers, Tommy Reeves, asked the group. "She's back from that fancy school in Boston." "Clara Bell," another man said, grinning. "That girl's going to drive some poor fool crazy. Pretty as a picture and twice as sharp. Mayor Bell's got his work cut out for him," added Davis, the mill's head sawyer. "Girl that educated doesn't usually take well to small-town life. She'll be wanting to head back east soon enough." Tommy shook his head. "My sister works at the Bell House. Says Clara's different now. Got ideas about women's rights and suffrage and all that. Mayor doesn't know what to make of her." Jesse half listened, chewing his sandwich. He'd heard variations of this conversation in every town: the local beauty, the worried father, the speculation about who she'd marry. It was none of his business, and he intended to keep it that way. "She's 24 now," Davis continued. "Should have been married years ago, according to Bell. But Clara turns down every man who comes calling. Says she's not interested in being someone's property." "Bold talk," Tommy said, though there was admiration in his voice. "My sister says Mrs. Bell encourages it, which doesn't sit well with the mayor." Jesse's attention sharpened at the mention of Mrs. Bell, though he kept his expression neutral. He'd been careful not to ask about the prominent families in town, not to show too much curiosity about anything that might require him to stay or get involved. But the name Bell triggered something in his memory, a common enough name, probably just coincidence. The afternoon passed in more sawdust and the high whine of blades through timber. By the time the quitting whistle blew, Jesse's arms ached in that satisfying way that meant he'd earned his pay. He collected his wages from Ben, cash on hand, another reason to like the job, and walked back toward town as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Bitter Ridge looked better at dusk. The harsh light softened, shadows lengthened, and the constant dust seemed to settle into something almost peaceful. Jesse detoured past Doc Winter's office, a habit he'd developed since arriving. The old doctor often sat on his porch in the evening, smoking a pipe and watching the world go by. He reminded Jesse of his grandfather, same quiet wisdom, same ability to read people without making them feel exposed. "Evening, Jesse," Doc called out as Jesse approached. "Good day at the mill." "Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow, probably." Jesse stopped at the base of the porch steps. "You need anything, Doc?" "I can run to the store if you're out of something." Doc Winters smiled around his pipe. "I'm fine, son, but I appreciate the offer. You planning to stick around Bitter Ridge for a while?" There was that question again. Jesse shrugged. "Long as the work holds out." "That's the thing about work," Doc said, his eyes twinkling. "It's got a way of holding out longer than a man expects, especially when he's got reason to stay." He puffed on his pipe, letting smoke curl into the evening air. "This is a good town, mostly. People here look after their own, believe in things like honor and community. Sometimes that can feel like a burden, but it's also what keeps a place like this alive." Jesse nodded, not sure what to say to that. He'd seen plenty of towns that believed in honor and community, and he'd seen how quickly those beliefs could turn into chains. "You be careful, son," Doc added, his tone shifting slightly. "I've been watching people in this town for 40 years, and I know when something's brewing. There's tension in the air lately, arguments over land and water rights. Sometimes good people do foolish things when they feel like their world's changing too fast. I'll keep that in mind." Jesse tipped his hat and continued toward the center of town. Sheriff Tate stood outside his office, A solid man in his 50s, with a star pinned to his vest and a face that had seen plenty of trouble. He nodded to Jesse as he passed, the kind of acknowledgement that law enforcement gave to newcomers they were still evaluating. Jesse nodded back, keeping his face neutral. He had no quarrel with the law, but he'd learned it was best to stay off any lawman's radar. The evening routine called to him, a meal at the boarding house, maybe a wash at the barber's if he felt like spending the money. Then back to his room to read by lamplight until sleep came. Simple, solitary, safe. The life he'd built out of the ruins of the one he'd imagined as a young man. But as Jesse walked past the Silver Dollar Saloon, he noticed a crowd gathering outside. Voices raised. That particular tone men get when they've been drinking and their pride is involved. Jesse kept walking, head down. Not his business. Never his business. Then he heard a woman's voice, sharp with anger rather than fear, cutting through the male rumble. I said no. I don't need to explain myself to you or anyone else. Jesse's feet stopped before his mind caught up with them. He turned, seeing the crowd more clearly now. A man had a woman by the arm, pulling her toward the saloon entrance, despite her obvious resistance. The man was young, well-dressed in the way of ranchers' sons, drunk enough to be stupid about it. The woman was struggling, her dress sleeve tearing in the man's grip. She was striking to look at. Dark hair pinned up, strong features, eyes that flashed with fury rather than panic. Several men stood around watching, that particular kind of watching that meant they were deciding whether to intervene or to look away. Jesse recognized that moment. He'd seen it before, that space where a situation could tip either toward decency or disaster, and the choice people made in that space told you everything about them and the place they lived. His hand was already moving to set down his lunch pail, his feet already carrying him toward the crowd, before he consciously decided to get involved. Some things you did because you decided who you were a long time ago, and changing that decision would mean becoming someone you couldn't live with. Let her go, Jesse said, his voice quiet but carrying. The crowd turned, sizing him up, the new man, the drifter, someone without standing or status in Bitter Ridge's careful hierarchy. The drunk man, Caleb something. Jesse had heard the name at the mill, tightened his grip on the woman's arm. This doesn't concern you, stranger. Miss Bell and I are having a private conversation. Bell. The name registered like a punch to the gut, but Jesse kept his expression steady. Doesn't look very private to me. And the lady asked you to let go. The woman, Clara Bell, Jesse understood now, looked at him with those fierce eyes. For a moment something flickered in her expression, recognition or surprise or something else he couldn't name. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite the torn dress and the drunk man's grip. I can handle this myself. I don't doubt it, Jesse said. But you shouldn't have to. What happened next would change everything, though Jesse didn't know it yet. He only knew that some lines couldn't be uncrossed. Some moments demanded action, regardless of consequence. And whatever life he'd built out of silence and distance was about to come to an end. He'd learned to live with endings. He'd had plenty of practice, but beginnings, those were harder. Those required something he thought he'd used up years ago. Back when he'd believed in futures and promises, and staying in one place long enough to call it home. The evening light caught the dust in the air, turning it gold. Somewhere a church bell rang, marking the hour. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, waiting to see what the stranger would do. Jesse looked at Clara Bell, really looked at her for the first time, and saw something in her face that made his breath catch. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful. Not her anger, though that was impressive. Something in the shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way she held herself, despite the indignity of her situation. She looked like someone he used to know, someone he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The moment stretched, waiting for someone to break it. Jesse took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and consequences. I'm asking politely, he said to Caleb. Let the lady go. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The mountains stood like sentinels around the valley, ancient and unmoved by human drama. And in that moment, With the whole town about to learn his name, Jesse Hart made a choice that would unravel everything he'd carefully constructed out of his solitude. He'd been running for 20 years. Maybe it was time to stop. Caleb Rourke's eyes narrowed at Jesse's words. His face flushed red, whether from whiskey or wounded pride, Jesse couldn't tell. Didn't matter much either way. A drunk man looking to prove something was dangerous, regardless of his motivation. You just made a mistake. Stranger, Caleb said, finally releasing Clara's arm but turning his full attention to Jesse. My father owns half this valley. You're a nobody working at Miller's Mill for day wages. You think you can tell me what to do? Jesse kept his hands loose at his sides, his stance relaxed but balanced. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm asking you to leave the lady alone. Simple as that. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the promise of conflict. Jesse could see Sheriff Tate pushing through the gathering, but the lawman was still 20 feet away. 20 feet was a long distance when fists were about to fly. Caleb, that's enough, Clara said, her voice cutting through the tension. You've had too much to drink. Go sleep it off. Don't you tell me what to do. Caleb spun back toward her, finger jabbing the air. You think you're better than everyone else, with your Boston education and your high and mighty attitude. Your father should have married you off years ago, before you got too proud to accept a decent proposal. That's enough. Jesse's voice hardened. He'd seen this pattern before. Men who thought women owed them something, who confused rejection with insult. It never ended well, unless someone stopped it early. Caleb swung without warning, a wild haymaker telegraphed by his shoulders. Jesse sidestepped easily, letting the momentum carry Caleb past him. The drunk man stumbled, catching himself on the saloon's porch rail. The crowd murmured, excitement rippling through them. Walk away, Jesse said quietly. There's no shame in it. You've been drinking. Tomorrow you'll be glad you didn't push this further, but tomorrow didn't matter to men like Caleb Rourke. Only the present moment, the witnesses, the need to prove something that probably couldn't be proven with fists anyway. He charged again, this time with more control, trying to tackle Jesse around the waist. Jesse moved like he'd been taught by older cowboys in rougher towns, efficiently, without wasted motion. He sidestepped, caught Caleb's shoulder, and used the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into the dust. The crowd gasped. Caleb came up spitting dirt, humiliation replacing drunkenness as his primary fuel. Stop this right now. Sheriff Tate's voice boomed across the scene. He'd finally pushed through the crowd, hand on his holstered pistol. Caleb, get up and go home. Jesse, step back, but Caleb wasn't done. He pulled himself up, reaching for something in his boot. A knife, Jesse realized, seeing the glint of steel in the lamplight from the saloon. The situation transformed in an instant from a drunken scuffle to something far more serious. Jesse moved without thinking, closing the distance before Caleb could bring the blade up. He caught Caleb's wrist, twisted hard, and the knife tumbled to the ground. Then Jesse's other hand found Caleb's collar, and he shoved the drunk man back against the saloon wall, hard enough to knock the wind out of him. It's over, Jesse said, his face inches from Caleb's. You hear me? It's over. Sheriff Tate was there in seconds, pulling Jesse back, positioning himself between the two men. Caleb Rourke, you drew a weapon on an unarmed man. That's assault with intent. I should lock you up right now. He attacked me first. Caleb wheezed, still trying to catch his breath. I saw the whole thing, Doc Winters called from the crowd. He'd appeared without Jesse noticing, materializing like he had a habit of doing when trouble started. The young man here acted in defense of Miss Bell, and then in self-defense. Caleb drew the knife. Other voices joined in, confirming Doc's account. But Jesse noticed something else happening in the crowd, a shift in focus, a change in the conversation. People were no longer looking at him and Caleb. They were looking at Clara. Her dress sleeve hung torn. Her hair had come partially loose from its pins, and she stood in front of a saloon, after dark, surrounded by men. In a town like Bitter Ridge, those details mattered more than the truth of what had actually happened. Jesse saw it in the faces of the women at the edge of the crowd, in the calculating looks of the older men. Clara's reputation, her standing, her future, all of it was being reassessed and judged in real time. Clara Bell What are you doing here?" The voice came from a tall, distinguished man pushing through the crowd. Even without introduction, Jesse knew him, Mayor Augustus Bell. He had the bearing of authority, the clothes of prosperity, and the expression of a man facing his worst nightmare. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I came to find you," Clara said, lifting her chin defiantly. "You promised to be home for dinner." Mother was worried. "So you went to a saloon?" Mayor Bell's voice carried equal parts anger and dismay. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "It looks like your daughter was assaulted by Caleb Rourke," Jesse heard himself say. "And it looks like she's got more spine than sense, coming here alone. But she's not the one who should be ashamed." Mayor Bell's eyes fixed on Jesse for the first time, really seeing him. Something flickered in those eyes. Recognition. No, that wasn't possible. Jesse had never been to Bitter Ridge before, but the mayor's gaze held steady, assessing, and Jesse felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd or the situation. "And who are you?" Mayor Bell asked. "Jesse Hart. I work at the mill. I was passing by when you decided to involve yourself in matters that don't concern you." The mayor's voice wasn't hostile exactly, but it carried the weight of a man used to being in control of situations. Before Jesse could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway of the saloon, Reverend Matthews, the town's elderly minister drawn by the commotion. His presence changed the atmosphere immediately. When a preacher witnessed something, it became official, recorded in the moral ledger that small towns kept on everyone. "I believe I understand what's happened here," Reverend Matthews said slowly, his voice carrying the gravity of his position. "Miss Bell's honor has been compromised regardless of the circumstances. She was seen in front of a saloon after dark, her dress torn, her reputation now subject to speculation and gossip." He looked directly at Jesse. "Young man, in defending her, you've created an obligation." Jesse felt the trap closing before anyone spoke the words. He could see it in the Reverend's eyes, in the mayor's tightening expression, in the eager attention of the crowd. This was about more than a simple altercation. This was about the town's rules, its codes, the way it maintained order and respectability. "In matters such as these," Reverend Matthews continued, "there is only one honorable course of action. You must marry her." The words hung in the evening air like smoke. Jesse waited for someone to laugh, to point out the absurdity of the suggestion. He'd helped a woman, stopped a drunk from hurting her. That didn't create some obligation to marry her. That was insane, but no one laughed. The crowd pressed closer, nodding. The Reverend looked satisfied. Sheriff Tate looked uncomfortable but resigned. And Mayor Bell looked like a man being forced to swallow poison. "That's ridiculous," Jesse said flatly. "I'm not marrying anyone. I'm leaving town tomorrow, and this whole thing can be forgotten. Can it?" The mayor asked quietly. "Can Clara go to church on Sunday and sit with the other unmarried women? Can she hold her head up when people whisper about the night she went to a saloon and came home with her dress torn? Can she have any hope of a respectable marriage now?" Jesse looked at Clara, expecting her to join his protest, to tell these people they were out of their minds. But she stood silent, her face unreadable, and Jesse realized she understood something he didn't: the precariousness of her position, the way small-town judgment could destroy a woman's life over something that wasn't her fault. "There must be another way," Jesse said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Marry her, or leave," Mayor Bell said, his voice hard now. "But if you leave, everyone in this town will know you're the kind of man who compromises a woman and then abandons her. You'll be marked as a coward, and word travels. Every town in the territory will hear about it. It was a trap, perfectly constructed by the weight of tradition and the power of reputation." Jesse had spent 20 years staying invisible, avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. And now, because he'd stepped in to help someone, he was being forced into the one thing he'd sworn he'd never do again: make promises about a future he couldn't control. "I need to think," Jesse said, hating how weak it sounded. "You have until morning," the mayor said. "Come to my house at 8 o'clock. We'll discuss arrangements." He turned to Clara, his voice softening slightly. "Come home, daughter. Your mother is worried. Clara moved to follow her father, but as she passed Jesse, she paused. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw anger, humiliation, and something else, a wild, desperate kind of courage. Before anyone could stop her, before Jesse could process what was happening, she grabbed him by the collar and pulled him down to her level. The kiss was brief, fierce, and entirely public. Her lips pressed against his with a force that felt like declaration or defiance or both. The crowd went utterly silent. Jesse stood frozen, shocked by the boldness of it, by the way her hand gripped his shirt like she was holding onto a lifeline. Then she released him and stepped back. "There," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street. "Now there's no question about it. I'm compromised beyond repair. The only question is whether Mr. Hart is gentleman enough to do what's right." She turned and walked away, following her father down the street. The crowd remained silent, processing what they'd witnessed. Jesse stood rooted in place, his mind reeling. The kiss had changed everything, transformed speculation into certainty, rumor into fact. Mayor Bell paused at the edge of the crowd, looking back at Jesse. 8 o'clock, he repeated. "Don't make my daughter wait." Then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the lamplight. The crowd began to disperse, already spreading the story. How the stranger had fought for Clara Bell's honor, how she'd kissed him in front of the whole town, how a wedding was surely coming. Jesse stood alone in the street, touching his lips where Clara Bell had kissed him. He could still feel the pressure, the intensity, the way her eyes had blazed with something between fury and determination. He'd thought he was helping her. Instead, he'd stepped into something far more complicated, something that reached back into his past and forward into a future he'd never wanted. Above him, the stars continued their ancient patterns, unmoved by human drama. Jesse looked up at them, seeking something, guidance, clarity, escape. But the stars offered no answers, only their distant, indifferent light. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, he'd face whatever came next. Tonight, he needed to understand what Clara Bell had really done with that kiss, and why, for just a moment, she'd looked at him like she knew exactly who he was. Jesse didn't sleep that night. He sat at the small table in his room, above the general store, staring at the worn saddle leaning against the wall, thinking about how quickly a man's life could change direction. One minute you were walking home from work, the next you were being pressured into marriage by an entire town. The absurdity of it should have been laughable. He'd helped a woman, acted on instinct and basic decency, and now he was trapped by the same moral codes he'd tried to escape 20 years ago. But the kiss that complicated everything. Clara Bell hadn't kissed him out of gratitude or affection. She'd kissed him like a chess player, making a decisive move, sacrificing pieces to win the game. The question was, what game was she playing? Jesse pulled out his saddlebag from beneath the bed, the leather cool under his fingers. Hidden in an inside pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from weather and wear, was a photograph. He unwrapped it carefully, though he knew every detail by heart. A young woman looked back at him, her face caught in that serious expression people wore for cameras in those days. But even through the formality, her beauty shone. Delicate features, intelligent eyes, dark hair pinned in the fashion of 20 years ago. Elizabeth Moore. She'd been 19 when this photograph was taken, and Jesse had been 21. Working as a ranch hand on her father's property outside of Helena, Montana. They'd fallen in love the way young people do, believing that feeling was enough to overcome any obstacle. They'd been wrong. Jesse traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, remembering. Her father had been a prosperous rancher then, before bad investments and worse weather had destroyed his fortune. Jesse had been nothing. A cowboy with dreams but no money, no property, no prospects worth mentioning. When he'd asked for Elizabeth's hand, her father had laughed in his face. "My daughter deserves better than a drifter who'll never amount to anything," the old man had said. "Come back when you're worth something," Jesse had tried. He'd worked harder, saved every penny, made plans for a future that seemed just within reach. But futures had a way of slipping through your fingers, especially when other men with more money and better prospects came calling. Augustus Bell had been one of those men. established, wealthy, offering security that Jesse could never match. Elizabeth had married Bell within 6 months. Jesse had left Montana the day after the wedding, riding south with nothing but his saddle and his pride. He'd spent the next 20 years moving from job to job, town to town, never staying long enough to feel anything deeper than passing familiarity. Now, by some cruel twist of fate, he'd ended up in Augustus Bell's town, tangled up with Augustus Bell's daughter, forced to confront everything he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. Jesse rewrapped the photograph and tucked it back into the saddlebag. He had choices to make. He could leave before dawn, ride out and never look back. Let Clara Bell and her family deal with the gossip. It would fade eventually. Small-town scandals always did, replaced by newer dramas and fresh targets. But even as he considered it, Jesse knew he wouldn't run. Not because of the town's judgment or the mayor's threats, but because of something he'd seen in Clara's eyes during that kiss. Desperation, determination, a woman making the only move she had left to change her circumstances. He understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. At 7:30 the next morning, Jesse stood on the porch of the mayor's house, hat in hand, watching the sun climb above the mountains. The Bell residence sat on a hill overlooking Bitter Ridge, a 2-story structure of white-painted wood with a wraparound porch and gardens that someone clearly tended with care. It spoke of stability, prosperity, roots sunk deep into the community. Everything Jesse had spent his life avoiding. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there, younger than Jesse, but wearing an apron that marked her as household help. "Mr. Hart, they're expecting you in the parlor. Follow me." Jesse stepped inside, removing his hat. The interior was as refined as the exterior, polished wood floors, elegant furniture, paintings on the walls. The scent of coffee and fresh bread drifted from somewhere deeper in the house. It was the kind of home people built when they believed in permanence, when they thought the future could be shaped and held onto. "In here, sir." The woman gestured to a doorway, and then disappeared down a hallway. Jesse entered a spacious parlor where Clara sat in a chair by the window, morning light illuminating her profile. She'd changed from the torn dress into a simple blue one that somehow made her look both younger and more formidable. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hart, thank you for coming. Did I have a choice?" Jesse remained standing, uncomfortable with the formality. "We always have choices," Clara said. "The question is whether we can live with the consequences." She gestured to a chair opposite her. "Please sit. My father will be here shortly. My mother is preparing tea." Jesse sat holding his hat in his lap. Up close, in daylight, Clara Bell was even more striking than she'd seemed in the chaos of the previous evening. But it wasn't her beauty that caught his attention. It was something in the set of her jaw, the directness of her gaze, the way she held herself with quiet confidence despite the situation. "I'm not asking you to love me," Clara said suddenly, her voice low and intense. "I'm not even asking you to like me. I'm asking you to help me escape." Jesse blinked. "Escape what?" "This." Clara gestured at the elegant room, the comfortable prison of her life. "My father has been trying to marry me off for years. Every man who's courted me has seen the same thing. The mayor's daughter, a prize to be won, a way to secure their social standing. None of them saw me, and you think I'm different." "I think you're a stranger," Clara said. "I think you'll be gone in 6 months or a year, and you'll take me with you. That's all I want, a way out of Bitter Ridge that doesn't involve giving up everything I am to become some rancher's wife and spend the rest of my life serving tea and pretending to care about cattle prices." Jesse studied her, impressed by her boldness and disturbed by her calculation. "You kissed me in front of the whole town just to manipulate me into this." "I kissed you to force the issue," Clara corrected. "Left to his own devices, my father would have found a way to smooth this over, arrange a marriage to some acceptable suitor, and lock me even more firmly into the life he wants for me. Now he has no choice. The town saw what they saw. Either you marry me, or my reputation is destroyed. It's actually quite simple. It's blackmail. It's survival." Clara's voice didn't waver. You don't know what it's like to have every decision made for you, every path chosen, before you can even see the alternatives. I went to school in Boston, Mr. Hart. I saw women working in offices, attending universities, living lives they chose for themselves. Then I came home and found myself right back in a cage, just one with prettier bars. Before Jesse could respond, the door opened and a woman entered carrying a silver tea service. Jesse turned to look at her and the world tilted sideways. Elizabeth, 20 years older. Her dark hair touched with grey, her face carrying the marks of time and experience. But unmistakably Elizabeth Moore, except she was Elizabeth Bell now, standing in the doorway of her elegant home, holding a tea tray with steady hands, while her eyes, those eyes Jesse had seen in his dreams for 2 decades, locked onto his with a shock that mirrored his own. The tea tray slipped. Elizabeth caught it before it fell, but the cups rattled violently. Clara jumped up to help her mother, taking the tray and setting it on a side table.
"Mother, are you all right?"
Elizabeth couldn't speak. She stared at Jesse and he stared back, and between them stretched 20 years of silence and sorrow and everything left unsaid when she'd married another man. "Mother?" Clara touched her arm, concerned now. Elizabeth found her voice, though it trembled. "I'm fine, dear. I thought I recognized Mr. Hart, but I must be mistaken. Do you know each other?" Clara looked between them, her sharp mind already processing the connection. "No," Elizabeth said firmly, even as her eyes told Jesse she'd recognized him instantly. "I don't believe we've met." "Welcome to our home, Mr. Hart." She extended her hand formally. Jesse rose and took it, feeling the familiar warmth of her skin against his. For a moment that lasted both an instant and forever, they stood connected, hands clasped. While a silver locket at Elizabeth's throat caught the morning light, Jesse's eyes dropped to the locket, a delicate piece of jewelry that looked old and cherished. He'd given Elizabeth a locket once, a cheap thing he'd saved months to afford. She'd worn it every day, promised she'd keep it forever. This wasn't the same one. This was finer, more expensive. Exactly the kind of thing Augustus Bell would buy for his wife, but the way she touched it, unconsciously, protectively, reminded Jesse of how she used to touch the one he'd given her. Some gestures stayed with people, he realized. Some promises remained even when everything else had changed. Clara watched her mother carefully, then looked at Jesse with new understanding dawning in her eyes. She saw the way they looked at each other, the electricity in the air, the weight of unspoken history. Her expression shifted from confusion to calculation to something softer, compassion perhaps, or recognition of kindred spirits caught in traps not of their own making. "Mother," Clara said gently, "why don't you pour the tea? I'm sure Mr. Hart and I have much to discuss before Father joins us." Elizabeth nodded, moving mechanically to the tea service. Her hands shook as she poured, and Jesse wanted to help her, to say something, to bridge the impossible distance between them. But Clara was there, her daughter, the living proof of the life Elizabeth had built without him. And Jesse finally understood why Clara had looked at him with such intensity the night before. Not because she knew who he was, but because she looked like her mother. The same eyes, the same determined set of her jaw, the same fierce intelligence burning behind a surface of expected propriety. Jesse had fallen in love with Elizabeth Moore 20 years ago. Now her daughter was asking him to marry her, and Elizabeth herself was pouring tea in her husband's house. And the past had found him despite all his running. Some things, he realized, couldn't be outrun. Some debts remained unpaid no matter how many years you put between yourself and the moment you'd failed to be brave enough. The china teacup felt fragile in Jesse's calloused hands, as out of place as he was in this refined parlor. He watched Elizabeth pour cream with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years performing such rituals, and he wondered how much of her was still the girl who'd met him in the barn at dawn, her hair loose and her laughter free. "Mr. Hart," Clara began, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "before my father arrives, I want to be clear about my proposal. This marriage would be one of convenience, a temporary arrangement that benefits us both. You'd gain respectability in town, steady work, and an eventual divorce once a suitable amount of time has passed. I'd gain freedom and time to plan my actual future. Jesse sipped his tea, buying time to think. And your father? He'll agree to this arrangement? My father, Clara said carefully, believes in honor and tradition. He'll see this marriage as salvaging a bad situation. What he doesn't know is that I have no intention of remaining Mrs. Hart for longer than necessary. Elizabeth set down the teapot with a soft clink. Clara, perhaps we should wait for your father before discussing such matters. Mother, father will try to take control of the conversation. He always does. Clara's voice held affection, but also frustration. I want Mr. Hart to understand my terms before father imposes his own. Your terms? Elizabeth's eyes flicked to Jesse, a warning in them he couldn't quite interpret. Marriage isn't a business negotiation, dear, isn't it? Clara leaned forward. You and father have a perfectly civil arrangement. He has his civic duties, his ranch concerns. You have your charitable work, your garden, your independence within the bounds of propriety. It works because you both understand your roles. Jesse saw Elizabeth flinch at her daughter's words, saw the way her hand moved to that locket again. Clara might think she understood her parents' marriage, but Jesse knew she'd missed something crucial. The difference between acceptance and contentment, between making peace with circumstances and choosing them freely. Clara, Jesse said slowly, you seem to have this all planned out. But you don't know me. I could be a drunk, a gambler, a man who'd take advantage of this situation in ways you haven't imagined. Could you? Clara met his gaze directly. Are you those things? No, but you have no way of knowing that. I have my judgment, Clara said. And I have the fact that you stepped in to help me last night when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. A man who'd take advantage would have walked away. The door opened, and Mayor Augustus Bell entered, his presence immediately dominating the room. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit, his bearing that of a man accustomed to authority. His eyes assessed Jesse with the practiced calculation of someone who'd spent years measuring other men's worth. Mr. Hart, you came. Bell crossed to the tea service, kissed his wife's cheek with perfunctory affection, and sat in the chair that was clearly his usual spot. I trust my daughter has been explaining the situation? She has, sir. Good. Then let's discuss terms. Bell accepted a cup of tea from Elizabeth without looking at her. You'll marry Clara in a small ceremony tomorrow, I think. No need to draw this out. You'll live here initially, in the guest cottage. I'll provide you with work on my ranch at a fair wage. In exchange, you'll treat my daughter with respect and discretion. Jesse set down his teacup. And after the marriage? What then? Then we see how things progress. Bell's voice held steel beneath the civility. Clara is headstrong, but she's young. She may find that married life suits her better than she expects. If not, well, we'll address that situation when we come to it. Father, we agreed, Clara began. We agreed that Mr. Hart would do the honorable thing, Bell interrupted. Beyond that, I make no promises. This situation is irregular enough without adding divorce to the scandal. Jesse watched Elizabeth during this exchange. She sat perfectly still, her face composed but her fingers worried at the locket. He remembered how she used to twist her hair when she was nervous, how she'd bite her lower lip when she was trying not to cry. The locket was a substitute for those tells, a socially acceptable outlet for the emotions she'd learned to hide. Mr. Hart. Bell's voice pulled Jesse's attention back. Do you find these terms acceptable? What Jesse found was the entire situation absurd, tragic, and somehow inevitable. He'd ridden into Bitter Ridge looking for anonymous work and temporary shelter. Instead, he'd stumbled into the life of the woman he'd once loved. And now her husband, the man who'd taken her from him, was arranging for Jesse to marry their daughter. If it weren't happening to him, he'd have laughed at the cosmic irony. I need to know something first, Jesse said. Why does Clara want to leave so badly? What's she running from? Bell's expression hardened. That's none of your concern. It is, if I'm marrying her. Father has had me engaged twice without my knowledge, Clara said quietly. Once to a cattle baron from Wyoming, who was 40 years my senior. Once to a banker in Miles City, who already had 3 wives buried and wanted a young one to give him more sons. Both times, Mother intervened before the arrangements were finalized. Jesse looked at Elizabeth, who met his gaze steadily now. "I won't let my daughter be sold to the highest bidder," she said, her voice soft but firm. "She deserves better, better like a drifter cowboy who'll be gone inside a year." Bell's words were sharp. "You have strange ideas about what's best for Clara." "Elizabeth, I have ideas about what freedom looks like," Elizabeth replied. And for just a moment, Jesse saw the girl she'd been, fierce, unafraid, willing to fight for what mattered. "Clara won't be trapped the way—" She stopped herself, but the implication hung in the air, the way I was. The unspoken words filled the space between them. Bell stood abruptly, his teacup rattling. "I'll expect you at the church tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Mr. Hart. Reverend Matthews will perform the ceremony. Don't be late." He left without another word, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. The three of them sat in the wake of his departure, the tension slowly dissipating like smoke after a fire. "I apologize for my husband," Elizabeth said finally. "He's not cruel, just controlling," Clara supplied, "incapable of seeing women as anything other than property, determined to shape the world to his specifications regardless of who gets hurt in the process." "Clara," Elizabeth's voice held a warning. "It's true, Mother, and you know it." Clara turned to Jesse. "Will you do it? Will you marry me tomorrow and help me escape this?" Jesse looked at Elizabeth, really looked at her. He saw the years written in the fine lines around her eyes, saw the quiet dignity she'd built from the ruins of her dreams, saw the love she had for her daughter that transcended her own regrets. And he saw something else, a silent plea asking him to give Clara what Elizabeth herself had never had, a choice. "Yes," Jesse said. "I'll marry you." Clara's shoulders dropped with relief. "Thank you. You won't regret this, I promise." But Jesse was already regretting it, not because of Clara, but because of the woman sitting across from him. The ghost of his past made flesh, the reminder of everything he'd lost and could never reclaim. Elizabeth rose to collect the tea things, and as she did, her hand brushed Jesse's shoulder, so brief it might have been accident, so deliberate it stopped his breath. "I'll show you out," she said. Her voice professionally polite, Jesse followed her to the front door, Clara remaining in the parlor. At the threshold, Elizabeth finally met his eyes directly, and the years collapsed between them. She was 45 and 19 simultaneously, married and free, his and forever lost. "Jesse," she whispered, "I never meant, I know. If I could have chosen differently, I know that too." She reached up and touched his face, just once, her fingers trembling. "Be kind to her. She's stronger than I was, but she'll need someone who understands what it means to want more than what you're given." "Elizabeth, I can't." Jesse couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say what he wanted to say, couldn't promise what she was asking, couldn't navigate the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. Tomorrow. Then Elizabeth stepped back, putting proper distance between them. "At the church. I'll be there watching my daughter marry the man She stopped, shook her head. "Watching my daughter marry you." Jesse left the Bell house and walked back toward town, the morning sun climbing higher, the day warming around him. He'd come to Bitter Ridge looking for nothing more than work and wages. Instead, he'd found the past waiting for him, wearing a different face, but asking the same impossible questions. Could you love someone's daughter when you'd never stopped loving them? Could you give someone freedom when your own life was built on running away? Could you face the woman you'd lost and help her daughter escape the same trap without destroying everyone in the process? Jesse didn't have answers. He only had tomorrow at 10 o'clock, a small church, and a wedding that would bind him to the past he'd been fleeing for 20 years. Above him, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent, and the sky offered no guidance. He was on his own, as he'd always been, making choices that would ripple through lives in ways he couldn't predict or control. The only certainty was that nothing would ever be simple again. 3 days passed in a strange suspension of reality. Jesse continued working at the mill, though everyone treated him differently now. The men offered congratulations, tinged with curiosity, wanting to know how a drifter had caught the eye of the mayor's daughter. Jesse offered nothing in return, keeping his counsel and his distance. The wedding itself had been a brief, formal affair. Clara wore a simple dress the color of cream. Jesse borrowed a suit from Doc Winters, and Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony in front of perhaps 30 witnesses. Elizabeth had stood in the front row, her face a mask of composure, while Mayor Bell had looked on with the expression of a man who'd calculated every possible outcome and found none of them satisfactory. When Jesse had kissed his bride, a chaste, obligatory press of lips, he'd felt Clara stiffen slightly, both of them aware of the performance they were giving. The wedding reception at the Bell House had lasted 2 uncomfortable hours, before Clara had pleaded exhaustion and Jesse had escaped to his room above the general store. They'd agreed to maintain separate residences initially, a decision that suited them both and raised only mild speculation in town. Now Jesse found himself in a strange limbo, married but not, committed but planning to leave, bound to a woman he barely knew, while haunted by the one he'd never forgotten. He threw himself into work, letting physical labor drive thoughts from his mind. But at night, alone in his room, the past crept in through the darkness. On the 3rd evening after the wedding, Jesse returned to his room to find an envelope slipped under his door. His name was written on the front in elegant, careful script, the kind of handwriting taught in finishing schools to young ladies of breeding. His heart hammered as he picked it up, already knowing who'd written it before he broke the seal. The note was brief. "Meet me at the old mill by the river. Midnight. Please come alone. There are things I must tell you before it's too late." Jesse sat on his bed, holding the paper as if it might disintegrate in his hands. The sensible thing would be to burn it, to never speak of it, to maintain the careful distance that was the only way any of them would survive this situation intact. Elizabeth was married. He was married to her daughter. There was no conversation that could make any of this better, only words that could make it worse. But at 10 minutes before midnight, Jesse found himself walking through the quiet streets of Bitter Ridge, heading toward the abandoned mill at the river's edge. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the landscape. His boots crunched on gravel, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. The old mill had been abandoned for years, replaced by the newer facility where Jesse worked. Its water wheel was frozen with rust, its walls weathered to grey, its windows empty as blind eyes. But it stood solid still, a monument to earlier industry, to a time when Bitter Ridge had been smaller and simpler, and less encumbered by the weight of its own respectability. Elizabeth waited in the shadow of the building, wrapped in a dark shawl that made her nearly invisible. Only the pale oval of her face caught the moonlight. Jesse approached slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to disappear back into the night, and leave whatever was between them unspoken and safely buried. But she didn't disappear. She stepped forward as he neared, and the moonlight revealed tears tracking down her face, the first genuine emotion he'd seen from her since his arrival in Bitter Ridge. "You came," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "You asked." Jesse stopped a few feet away, maintaining the distance that propriety demanded even here, in darkness, where no one could see them. "Elizabeth, we shouldn't." I know we shouldn't." She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made Jesse's chest ache. "But I couldn't let you marry Clara, couldn't watch you become part of this family without telling you the truth, without saying the things I should have said 20 years ago. The past is past. What good can come from, 'Why did you come back?'" The question burst from her like it had been building pressure for days. "Why Bitter Ridge? Why now? Do you have any idea what it's been like? Seeing you again, watching you sit in my house. Marry my daughter, while I—" She stopped, breathing hard, fighting for control. Jesse took a step closer despite himself. "I didn't know you were here. I had no idea you'd married Bell, that this was his town. If I'd known, I never would have come. I believe you." Elizabeth pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You always ran from complications, from anything that required you to stay and fight for what you wanted. The accusation stung because it was true. Jesse had spent 20 years running, choosing movement over confrontation, distance over depth. "You married him," he said quietly. "You chose him over me. What was I supposed to fight for after that?" "I didn't choose him." Elizabeth's voice rose, then fell again to a whisper. "I was forced. My father was bankrupt, Jesse, completely ruined. We were going to lose everything, the ranch, the house, everything. Augustus offered to save us, to pay off all the debts, if I married him. It wasn't a proposal. It was a business transaction." Jesse felt the ground shift beneath him. "You never told me your father was in financial trouble, because I didn't want you to try to solve it. You would have done something foolish, taken risks you couldn't afford." Elizabeth's face was wet with tears now, her composure completely gone. "I loved you too much to watch you destroy yourself trying to save me. So you destroyed yourself instead. I survived. There's a difference." Elizabeth moved closer, close enough that Jesse could smell the lavender water she'd always worn, could see the silver threads in her dark hair. "I survived, and I raised a daughter who's stronger than I was, braver than I was. And now you're going to help her escape the cage I could never open." Jesse wanted to reach for her, wanted to bridge the 20-year gap with touch, wanted to undo every decision that had brought them to this moment. But touching her would be a betrayal of Clara, of Augustus, of the vows he'd just spoken, regardless of how hollow they felt. "Elizabeth, what do you want from me?" "I want—" She stopped, laughed bitterly. "I want the impossible. I want to be 19 again, brave enough to run away with you regardless of the consequences. I want to not have spent 20 years in a marriage where I'm respected but not loved, valued but not cherished. I want—" Her voice broke completely. "I want my daughter to have what I couldn't, freedom, choice, a chance to live on her own terms. And you—" Jesse couldn't help asking, "What about what you want?" Elizabeth looked up at him, and in the moonlight he saw everything she couldn't say. The longing, the regret, the love that had survived 2 decades of silence. "What I want doesn't matter anymore. I made my choices. I have to live with them. You could leave. Divorce him. It's not easy. No, it's not easy. It's scandalous and difficult and would destroy my standing in this community." She smiled sadly. "But I've thought about it. More than I should. More than is probably wise." They stood in the shadow of the old mill, 2 people who'd loved each other once and never quite stopped, separated by circumstances and choices and the impossible weight of time. The river murmured in the darkness, the wheel creaked in the wind, and somewhere an owl called its lonely song. "We can't do this," Jesse said finally. "We can't meet like this, can't have these conversations. It's not fair to Clara or to my husband." Elizabeth's laugh was sharp. "Augustus doesn't love me, Jesse. He wanted me, won me like I was a prize in a contest. He's never once asked what I want, what I dream about, what keeps me awake at night. Our marriage is perfectly civil and absolutely empty." Jesse understood empty. He'd built a life out of it, filled 20 years with work and wages and the absence of connection. But hearing Elizabeth describe her own emptiness made it feel obscene, unbearable wrong in ways his solitary wandering never had. "Then leave him," Jesse said. "If you're that unhappy, if the marriage is that hollow, leave. You don't have to stay trapped, don't I?" Elizabeth moved even closer, until they were almost touching, until Jesse could feel the warmth of her breath. "Where would I go? What would I do? I'm 45 years old with no money of my own, no skills beyond managing a household and arranging flowers. Augustus owns everything, the house, the ranch, even the clothes I wear. If I leave with nothing. You'd have your freedom. Freedom costs more than you think." She raised her hand, hesitated, then touched his face, the same gesture she'd made at the door 3 days ago. But longer now, more deliberate. "I've watched you this week. Seen how you move through the world, unattached, uncommitted. It looks like freedom from the outside, but is it? Or are you just as trapped as I am, just in a different kind of cage?" The question hit deeper than Jesse wanted to admit. He'd told himself for years that his wandering was freedom, that his refusal to settle was strength. But standing here with Elizabeth's hand on his face, he recognized the truth. He'd been running from the pain of losing her, running from the possibility of ever feeling that much again, running from everything that made life meaningful, because meaning always came with the risk of loss. Elizabeth. Her name on his lips was prayer and curse and everything between. "We can't do this." "I know," but she didn't move her hand. "I know we can't, but just for this moment, just once, let me pretend that things ended differently, that we made different choices, that you and I—" Jesse caught her hand, gently removing it from his face, even as everything in him wanted to pull her closer. "We can't live in pretend. We have to live in what is." "What is?" Elizabeth's voice was nearly a whisper. "What is that I see the man I loved in my daughter's husband. What is that I watch you both planning to leave, and part of me wants to stop you because I can't bear to lose you again. And part of me wants to help you because Clara deserves everything I couldn't have. What is that I'm standing in the darkness asking the impossible of a man who owes me nothing. What are you asking? Promise me you'll be kind to her. Promise me that when you help her escape Bitter Ridge, you'll make sure she lands somewhere safe, somewhere she can build a real life." Elizabeth's eyes held his. "And promise me that you won't make her pay for my mistakes. I would never. Promise me." "Jesse, I promise." The vow felt heavier than the wedding vows he'd spoken 3 days ago, more binding than any legal contract. "I'll take care of her. I'll help her find her freedom. And I'll make sure she never ends up like—" He stopped himself before saying "like us," but Elizabeth heard it anyway. They parted with nothing more said, Elizabeth disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Jesse standing alone beside the broken mill with his thoughts in turmoil. He didn't return to his room immediately. Instead, he walked the empty streets of Bitter Ridge, letting the night air clear his head, trying to separate what he wanted from what was possible. By the time dawn broke, he'd made his peace with it. Elizabeth was lost to him, had been lost for 20 years. Clara was his responsibility now, not because of love or desire, but because he'd made a promise to her and to her mother. He'd help Clara escape, see her settled somewhere safe, then disappear again into the life he'd built out of distance and solitude. Simple, clean, the kind of plan that could actually work if everyone played their parts. 2 days later, Clara asked Jesse to meet her at the bluff overlooking the valley. It was the first time she'd sought him out since the wedding, and Jesse found her there mid-afternoon, sitting on a flat rock with a leather-bound book in her lap. The view was spectacular. The town spread below like a toy village, the mountains rising in every direction, the sky impossibly vast and blue. "Thank you for coming," Clara said as Jesse approached. She'd changed from her formal dresses into simpler clothes, a plain skirt and shirtwaist that made her look younger, less guarded. "I wanted to show you something, to help you understand what I'm asking of you." Jesse sat on a boulder nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "I already agreed to help you. You don't need to convince me. I think I do." Clara opened the leather book. "Because I don't want you to think I'm just a spoiled girl running away from responsibility. There's more to it than that." The book, Jesse realized, was a sketch journal. Clara turned it so he could see. Page after page of detailed drawings rendered in pencil and charcoal. Cities he recognized, Boston, New York, Chicago, and places he didn't. Harbors and markets, buildings with soaring architecture, street scenes full of life and movement. Every drawing was precise, skilled, revealing an artist's eye and a draftsman's discipline. "These are beautiful," Jesse said honestly. "Where did you learn to draw like this?" "School in Boston. I studied architecture." Clara's voice warmed with passion. "Not formally. Women weren't allowed in the architecture program. But I took every art and mathematics course they'd let me enroll in, and I haunted the offices of architectural firms, studying their designs, learning how buildings are conceived and constructed." She turned more pages, showing him sketches of buildings that didn't exist yet, designs she'd created, complete with annotations about materials and measurements and structural considerations. "I want to design buildings, Jesse, real buildings that people will use and live in and remember. Not just manage a household or arrange flowers or host tea parties. Jesse studied the drawings with new appreciation. These aren't just dreams. You've actually studied this for 6 years. Every chance I got. Clara closed the book carefully, holding it against her chest. Then I came home, and my father told me I'd wasted my education, that no one would ever hire a female architect, that I needed to put aside childish ambitions and focus on finding a suitable husband. So you kissed a stranger in front of the whole town. Clara laughed, the first genuine laughter Jesse had heard from her. Not my best plan, admittedly, but I was running out of options. Father had already started negotiating with another suitor, a land speculator from Cheyenne who saw me as a way to access Father's political connections. I had to do something drastic. Jesse looked at her with new understanding. She wasn't spoiled or impulsive. She was desperate, fighting for dreams in a world determined to crush them. Where will you go? If we leave Bitter Ridge, where do you want to end up? San Francisco, Clara said immediately. I have contacts there. Women from school who are working in architects' offices, doing the drafting and calculations that men take credit for. It's not perfect, but it's a start. And the city is more progressive than here. Women have more opportunities, more freedom to pursue unconventional paths. San Francisco is expensive. You'll need money. I have savings. Money my grandmother left me that Father can't touch. Clara's expression turned calculating. And I've been selling drawings to magazines back east, architectural sketches, illustrations of frontier buildings. It's not much, but it's mine. Earned by my work, not given by a husband or father. Jesse found himself impressed, despite himself. Clara wasn't just running from something. She was running toward a future she'd actively planned and prepared for. How long before you're ready to leave? A month, maybe 2. I need to arrange lodging in San Francisco. Secure a position with one of the firms that's willing to hire women. Clara looked at him carefully. Will you still be here in 2 months? Or are you planning to disappear sooner? I'll stay as long as you need me to. Jesse made the commitment without hesitation, though part of him warned that staying meant more encounters with Elizabeth, more opportunities for painful conversations and impossible longings. There's something between you and my mother, Clara said suddenly, her directness catching Jesse off guard. I'm not blind. The way you look at each other, the tension in the room when you're both present, something happened between you a long time ago. Jesse considered lying, then decided Clara deserved the truth. Your mother and I were engaged once, before she married your father, 20 years ago in Montana. Her father opposed the match, circumstances intervened, and she married your father instead. I left and never looked back until I ended up here by accident. Clara absorbed this quietly. Does she know you're here? I mean, did she know before? No. We recognized each other the day I came to your house. Neither of us had any idea we'd end up in the same place again. That must be, Clara searched for the word. Complicated. That's one way of putting it. They sat in silence for a while, watching hawks circle over the valley. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice softer. My parents don't love each other. I've known that since I was a child. They're polite, functional, but there's no warmth between them. I used to wonder why they married at all. Now I understand it was a transaction. He got a beautiful wife from a good family. She got financial security. Neither of them got happiness. Marriage was different back then. Often still is. Jesse picked up a stone, turned it over in his hand. People made practical choices, not romantic ones. Is that what you're doing with me? Making a practical choice? Jesse met her eyes. Yes, and I think that's what you're doing with me. We're both using each other to escape something. That doesn't make it wrong, just honest. Clara smiled, genuine respect in her expression. I like you, Jesse Hart. You don't try to pretend things are other than they are. That's rare, especially among men who want something from me. I don't want anything from you beyond what we agreed to. Help each other, then go our separate ways. Is that really what you want? To keep going your separate way, never settling, never belonging anywhere? Clara tilted her head, studying him. Seems lonely. Lonely is safe. Safe from what? Jesse didn't answer, and Clara let it drop. They sat watching the valley as the afternoon light shifted, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Jesse found himself relaxing in Clara's presence, appreciating her blunt honesty, her lack of pretense, her clear-eyed understanding of what they were to each other. Movement below caught his attention, a rider on the road leading to the bluff. Jesse's instincts prickled even before he recognized the horse. Caleb Rourke, the drunk who'd started this whole mess, riding slowly up the trail toward them. "We should go," Jesse said, standing. Clara followed his gaze. "He's been watching me, watching us. He blames you for humiliating him. I know the type. Pride injured, reputation damaged, needs to even the score." Jesse offered Clara his hand, helping her up. "Come on. I don't want to be alone with him up here where no one can see." They made their way down the trail, but Caleb cut them off halfway, his horse blocking the narrow path. He'd been drinking again. Jesse could smell the whiskey from 6 feet away, but his eyes were clear enough, focused and angry. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," Caleb sneered. "The drifter and the mayor's daughter. Quite a step up for you, Hart. Move aside, Caleb," Jesse said evenly. "We're heading back to town. I've been thinking about that night outside the saloon. How you made me look like a fool. How everyone laughed." Caleb's hand moved toward his belt, where Jesse now saw he carried a pistol. "You think you can come into my town, steal my girl, embarrass me in front of everyone, and just walk away?" "She was never your girl," Clara said sharply. "I rejected your advances months ago, and I told Father I'd never marry you, even if you were the last man in the territory." Caleb's face flushed red. "You'll regret that. Both of you will." Jesse positioned himself between Caleb and Clara, his mind calculating distances and angles. Caleb was drunk enough to be stupid, but sober enough to be dangerous. The gun changed everything. In a fair fight, Jesse could handle him. But there was nothing fair about a drunk man with a pistol on a narrow mountain trail. "This is a bad idea, Caleb," Jesse said calmly. "Whatever you're thinking, it ends badly for you. Clara's my wife now. Her father is the mayor. Sheriff Tate is already looking for an excuse to arrest you after the knife incident. Don't give him a reason." Caleb's hand hovered over his pistol, indecision flickering across his face. For a long moment, Jesse thought it might go either way, violence or retreat. Then Caleb spat on the ground between them and hauled his horse to the side of the trail. "This isn't over," he said. "You'll pay for what you did. Both of you." He rode past them down the trail, his horse kicking up dust. Jesse watched until he disappeared around a bend, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We need to be careful," Jesse said. "He's dangerous, and he's humiliated. That combination leads to bad decisions." Clara nodded, her face pale but composed. "Father should know about this. He needs to do something about Caleb before what? Before Caleb does something we can't take back?" Jesse took her arm gently, guiding her down the trail. "Your father knows what Caleb is. But Caleb's father is wealthy, influential. That complicates things. Everything in this town is complicated by money and influence." Clara's voice held bitter understanding. "It's one more reason to leave." They walked back to town in thoughtful silence, both aware that time was running shorter than they'd planned. Caleb represented more than just a personal threat. He represented everything, suffocating and dangerous about a society built on pride and property and the protection of men's reputations. At the cost of everything else, Jesse had promised to help Clara escape. Now he understood the urgency, not just because she wanted freedom, but because staying meant being trapped in a system that valued appearances over truth, violence over justice, and tradition over every dream that didn't fit its narrow definitions. 2 months, Clara had said. Jesse wondered if they had even that long before something broke that couldn't be repaired. The wedding day arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of late autumn morning that made you forget winter was coming. Clara had insisted on a small ceremony, despite her father's preference for something more elaborate, and Jesse was grateful. The fewer witnesses to what felt like an elaborate performance, the better. The church was simple, its wooden pews worn smooth by years of Sunday services. Sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like small spirits. Jesse stood at the altar in his borrowed suit, watching Clara walk down the aisle alone. She'd refused her father's arm, a small rebellion that had made Mayor Bell's jaw tighten, but his objections die unspoken. Clara wore a dress the color of morning cream, simple and elegant. Her hair was pinned up, revealing the graceful line of her neck, and she carried no flowers. She looked beautiful and solemn, and nothing like a blushing bride. She looked like a woman making a strategic move in a game she intended to win. Elizabeth sat in the front row, her face composed, but her eyes, those eyes Jesse knew so well, full of complicated emotions he couldn't name. She wore her finest dress, a deep blue that made her look younger somehow, and that locket he'd noticed before glinted at her throat. Mayor Bell sat beside her, rigid and formal, a man performing his duty while hating every moment of it. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with efficient solemnity. Jesse spoke his vows, feeling like a fraud, and Clara spoke hers with clear-eyed pragmatism. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Jesse kissed his wife with the chaste formality of a business contract being signed. The reception at the Bell House was as uncomfortable as Jesse had anticipated. Townspeople came to pay their respects, to examine the unlikely couple, to gossip in corners about how strange it all was. Jesse endured it with practiced patience, playing the role of grateful bridegroom, while Clara played dutiful daughter, and Elizabeth played perfect hostess, and Mayor Bell drank more whiskey than Jesse had seen him consume at any previous gathering. As the afternoon wore on, Bell's drinking grew more noticeable, his movements less controlled, his voice carrying further than it should. He stood with a group of ranchers near the fireplace, discussing water rights and land disputes, his words starting to slur at the edges. Jesse had seen this pattern before. Men who held themselves too tightly, who built their lives on control and propriety, sometimes came undone when the foundations shifted. "Mr. Hart, a word." Mayor Bell's voice cut through the polite chatter. He swayed slightly, steadying himself on the fireplace mantel. "In my study, if you don't mind." Time we had a man-to-man conversation. Jesse followed Bell through the house to a room he hadn't seen before, a masculine space of dark wood and leather. Walls lined with bookshelves, a massive desk dominating one end. A portrait of Elizabeth as a young woman hung above the fireplace, and Jesse tried not to look at it, tried not to think about how Bell had claimed that beauty for himself through manipulation and money. "Sit," Bell gestured to a chair, then poured himself another drink from a crystal decanter. "Drink?" "No, thank you." Bell settled into the chair behind his desk with the careful precision of a man aware he's had too much to drink and trying to hide it. "You married my daughter today, made yourself part of this family. I suppose that means I should welcome you properly, offer you opportunities, ensure your success." "I appreciate that, sir. Do you?" Bell's eyes focused on Jesse with sudden sharpness. "Do you appreciate the position you're in? The advantages you've gained by marrying Clara? Men work their whole lives to achieve what you stumbled into by accident." Jesse kept his voice neutral. "I understand I'm fortunate." "Fortunate?" Bell laughed bitterly. "You're a drifter with no prospects who happen to be in the right place at the right time. Or the wrong place, depending on your perspective." He sipped his whiskey, his eyes never leaving Jesse. "You know what I see when I look at you. I see myself 30 years ago, hungry, ambitious, willing to do whatever it took to rise above my station. I'm not ambitious, sir. I just want—" "What? To help Clara escape? To take my daughter away from everything I've built for her?" Bell's voice rose, then dropped again as he fought for control. "You think I don't know what she's planning? I've known since the day she came home from Boston with her head full of ridiculous ideas about women's rights and professional careers. She wants freedom, and she thinks you're the key to it." Jesse said nothing, aware that Bell was working through something, using the whiskey and the private setting to say things he normally kept locked inside. "I did everything for her," Bell continued. "Everything. Built this empire, secured her future, made sure she'd never have to struggle the way I did. And what does she do? She rejects every suitable match, embarrasses me with her education and her opinions, and then kisses a stranger in the street like some common—" He stopped himself, took another drink. Clara is remarkable, Jesse said quietly. She's intelligent, talented, determined. Maybe instead of trying to control her future, you should trust her to build her own. Bell's laugh was harsh. Trust, that's rich coming from you. How much do you know about trust, Hart? About commitment? You've spent 20 years drifting from town to town, never staying, never building anything. And now you're going to teach me about my daughter. Jesse felt anger rising, but kept it leashed. With respect, sir, I married your daughter today. Whether you approve or not, she's my wife now. And I intend to treat her with the dignity and freedom she deserves. Freedom. Bell stood abruptly, swaying slightly. Everyone talks about freedom like it's some sacred right. But freedom is chaos. Freedom is people making choices they'll regret, destroying careful plans, undermining everything that keeps society stable. He crossed to a cabinet near the window, fumbled with a key, then seemed to change his mind. You know what? Never mind. Go back to the party. Tell Clara I'll be out shortly. But as Bell turned away, the cabinet door swung open slightly. He'd unlocked it but hadn't closed it properly. And through the gap, Jesse saw papers, old documents, the edge of what looked like a property deed. Actually, Bell said, stumbling slightly as he headed for the door, I need some air. Too much whiskey, too much everything. Stay here if you want. Gather yourself before facing the crowd again. He left, closing the study door behind him. Jesse sat alone in the room, the portrait of young Elizabeth watching him from above the fireplace. And that partially open cabinet drawer calling to his curiosity like a whisper in the dark. He shouldn't. It was wrong to snoop through another man's private papers. But something about Bell's behavior, about the way he'd referenced that cabinet, then stopped himself, about the desperate edge in his drinking, made Jesse stand and cross the room. The cabinet was old, well-made, designed to protect valuable documents. Inside were property deeds, business papers, legal documents organized in careful folders. Jesse's hands moved almost of their own accord, pulling out the oldest folder, the one whose edges were worn from years of handling. Inside was a land deed dated 23 years ago. The property, Moore Ranch, Helena, Montana. The seller, James Moore, Elizabeth's father. The buyer, Augustus Bell. Jesse's heart hammered as he read the details. The sale price was absurdly low, well below the property's value. The sale terms, immediate payment of outstanding debts in exchange for deed transfer. The signature, James Moore, witnessed and notarized, but there was another document clipped to the deed, a letter yellowed with age in Augustus Bell's handwriting. Jesse's hands shook as he read, Thompson, your work was excellent. Moore never suspected the drought was artificially created by diverting his water rights to neighboring properties. By the time he realized what was happening, his cattle were dying and his debts mounting. He'll have no choice but to sell to me at the price I dictate. Once the property is mine, I'll restore the water rights and turn a healthy profit. More importantly, I'll have leverage over his daughter, who will have no choice but to accept my marriage proposal if she wants to save her family from complete ruin. Sometimes fortune favors those willing to create their own opportunities. Jesse read the letter 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. Bell hadn't just taken advantage of Moore's financial troubles, he'd created them. He'd deliberately destroyed Elizabeth's father to force her into marriage. Every choice she'd made, every sacrifice, every year of her life with Bell had been built on this manipulation, this calculated cruelty. The door opened. Jesse spun, the letter still in his hand, to find Clara standing in the doorway. Her eyes went from his face to the open cabinet to the letter in his hand, and understanding dawned in her expression. What is it? She asked quietly, closing the door behind her. Jesse handed her the letter without speaking. He watched as she read, saw her face pale, saw her hand begin to tremble. When she finished, she looked up at him with horror in her eyes. He destroyed her father deliberately. He forced her to marry him? Yes, my mother, she didn't choose him. She never chose him. She was coerced, manipulated. Clara's voice broke. And she's lived with him for 20 years, probably thinking she made a choice for her family's sake, never knowing that she was trapped from the beginning, that there was never a real choice. Jesse took the letter back, his mind racing. Clara, this changes everything. If Elizabeth knew— She doesn't. I'm certain she doesn't. Clara sank into a chair, her face ashen. If she knew father had done this, that he deliberately ruined her family to force her into marriage, she would have— What? Left him with what money? Where would she go? Jesse felt rage building in his chest. 20 years of anger finally finding a target. Bell made sure she had no options, no independence, no way to escape. He didn't marry her. He imprisoned her. Clara looked at the letter again, then at Jesse. We have to tell her, do we? What good would it do? It would only hurt her more, make her realize the last 20 years were even worse than she thought. She has a right to know. Does she? Or do we have a right to burden her with this truth? Jesse paced the study, his hands clenched into fists. Bell is a monster, but he's her husband, your father. Exposing this destroys everything. Everything is already destroyed, Clara said quietly. Our family has been built on a lie, on manipulation and cruelty. Mother has the right to know why her life turned out the way it did. Before Jesse could respond, the study door opened again. Elizabeth stood there, her face composed, but her eyes sharp with concern. I came looking for you both. Guests are asking— She stopped, seeing their expressions, seeing the letter in Clara's hand. Her gaze moved to the open cabinet, to the papers visible inside, and something in her face changed. What have you found? Clara stood, holding out the letter. Mother, there's something you need to see. Something about how father really married you. Elizabeth took the letter with steady hands. Jesse watched as she read, saw the color drain from her face, saw 20 years of understanding shift and reorganize into a new, terrible clarity. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk. Her hands were shaking now, her breathing shallow. Elizabeth, Jesse started. Her voice was barely a whisper. I need a moment, please. She turned and left the study, moving like someone in a dream. Clara started to follow, but Jesse caught her arm. I'll give her time. Let her process this. They stood in Bell's study, surrounded by the trappings of his success, his respectability, his carefully constructed life. And Jesse understood now why Bell had drunk so much today, why he'd seemed almost desperate. Some part of him knew his foundations were cracking, that the truth he'd buried for 20 years might finally surface. Outside, in the parlor, guests laughed and chatted, celebrating a marriage that was itself a kind of escape from Bell's control. But in this room, with the evidence of his greatest crime lying on his desk, Jesse felt something shift. This wasn't just about helping Clara escape anymore. It was about justice for Elizabeth, about exposing the cruelty Bell had built his empire on, about ensuring that no one else would be trapped by his manipulations. The game had changed. The stakes were higher, and somewhere in this house, Elizabeth was confronting the truth that her entire adult life had been stolen from her through calculated malice. Jesse looked at Clara and saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. Whatever happened next, they were in it together now. And Augustus Bell was about to learn that some secrets once exposed couldn't be reburied. The guests began leaving as evening approached, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind closed doors. Jesse stood at the parlor window watching them depart, making polite conversation when required, while his mind churned with questions about what came next. Where was Elizabeth? What was she thinking? And when Bell returned from wherever he'd gone, what would happen when he realized his secret had been discovered? Clara moved through the crowd with practiced grace, playing her role as new bride, but Jesse could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting toward the staircase where her mother had disappeared. They were both waiting for something to break, for the careful facade to finally crack open and reveal the rot beneath. Doc Winters appeared at Jesse's elbow, his weathered face creased with concern. You all right, son? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just tired, Jesse lied. It's been a long day. Marriage will do that to you. Doc studied him with those sharp eyes that saw too much. But I'd wager there's more to it than that. I've been watching the mayor tonight. Man's drinking like he's trying to drown something. And Mrs. Bell disappeared an hour ago and hasn't returned. Trouble in paradise already. Jesse chose his words carefully. Family dynamics are complicated, Doc. They are indeed. Doc patted his arm. Just remember, whatever storms come, you've got friends in this town. Don't try to weather them alone. It was kindly meant, but Jesse knew they were already past the point where friendly advice could help. They'd uncovered something too big, too destructive to be smoothed over with good intentions and patience. The last guests finally departed as twilight deepened into night. The hired help began clearing dishes and empty glasses, their movements efficient and invisible in the way of servants who'd learned not to intrude on family dramas. Jesse found Clara in the empty parlor, her composure finally cracking now that they were alone. "Where is she?" Clara asked. "Mother's been upstairs for hours. Should we give her time?" But even as Jesse said it, he heard footsteps on the stairs. They both turned to see Elizabeth descending, her face pale but composed, her back straight, with a determination Jesse remembered from when she was young. She'd changed from her fine dress into simpler clothes, and she carried a small leather case in her hand. "Mother?" Clara moved toward her. "Are you all right?" "I'm leaving." Elizabeth's voice was steady, each word deliberate. "I'm leaving your father, leaving this house, leaving this marriage, tonight." The pronouncement hung in the air like smoke. Clara gasped. But Jesse had somehow expected it, had known that a woman like Elizabeth couldn't learn what she'd learned and simply return to her prison. "Mother, you don't have to decide this tonight. You can take time, think it through. I've had 20 years to think." Elizabeth set down her case and crossed to her daughter, taking Clara's hands in her own. 20 years of living a lie, of telling myself that I made a choice for good reasons, that my sacrifice saved my family. But I didn't sacrifice myself. I was stolen. Your father deliberately destroyed my family so he could force me into marriage. That's not choice, Clara. That's kidnapping with legal paperwork. Jesse watched mother and daughter, seeing the similarity in their fierce determination, their refusal to accept the constraints society tried to place on them. Elizabeth had been forced into submission 20 years ago, but Clara's rebellion had awakened something in her that wouldn't be quieted again. "Where will you go?" Clara asked softly. "Sacramento. I have a cousin there who's been urging me to visit for years. She owns a boarding house and needs help managing it." Elizabeth's smile was sad, but genuine. "It's not grand, but it's honest work, and it's mine. I've been saving money for 10 years, ever since I found out the truth about what kind of man I married." Jesse started. "You knew?" "About the land manipulation?" "No, not about that. But I knew—" Elizabeth's voice wavered, then steadied. "I knew he'd been unfaithful repeatedly. I knew he'd used his position to force other families into disadvantageous deals. I knew he cared more about his reputation and his wealth than about the people he claimed to love. Finding out tonight that he destroyed my father deliberately is just the final piece of a puzzle I've been assembling for years." She moved to the fireplace mantel, where her wedding ring caught the lamplight. With deliberate slowness, Elizabeth removed the ring from her finger, a wide gold band set with diamonds that represented everything Bell's money could buy. She held it for a moment, studying it like an artifact from someone else's life, then placed it in Clara's palm. "This ring represents chains," Elizabeth said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've worn it for 20 years, felt its weight on my finger, used it to remind myself of my duty. But duty that's born of deception isn't duty at all. It's slavery. I want you to have it, to sell it, to throw it in the river. I don't care. What matters is that you're free of what it represents." Clara closed her fingers around the ring, tears streaming down her face. "Come with us. When Jesse and I leave Bitter Ridge, come with us. We'll help you start over." "No." Elizabeth cupped her daughter's face with both hands. "This is my fight. I need to do this myself, to walk out of this house on my own terms, to prove to myself that I can. You have your own journey ahead of you. Let me have mine." Mother and daughter embraced, both crying now, two women finding strength in each other's courage. Jesse turned away, giving them privacy, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. "Jesse!" Elizabeth's voice drew him back. She'd released Clara and now stood before him, her eyes red but clear. "I need to tell you something." 20 years ago, when I married Augustus, I told myself it was for the right reasons. That I was protecting my family, making the practical choice, doing what had to be done. But the truth is, she paused, gathering courage. The truth is that I was also afraid. Afraid of choosing love over security. Afraid of building a life that wasn't guaranteed. Afraid of following my heart instead of my head. I was a coward, Jesse, and I've paid for that cowardice every day since. Elizabeth, let me finish. She raised her hand. I need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. Not because Augustus was cruel, though finding out what he did makes it worse, but because I chose fear over love. I chose safety over happiness. And I've regretted it every single day. Jesse felt tears burning his own eyes. You did what you thought was right. No one can fault you for that. I fault myself. Elizabeth moved closer. Close enough that Jesse could smell the lavender water she wore, could see the silver in her hair and the lines around her eyes that testified to years of smiling when she didn't mean it. But I'm not asking for forgiveness or for another chance. I'm asking you to do for my daughter what I was too afraid to do for myself. Help her choose freedom over security, love over duty, truth over comfortable lies. I promised you I would. I know. And I believe you. Elizabeth raised her hand to his face one final time, her touch gentle and final as a benediction. Thank you for coming back into my life, even accidentally. Thank you for showing me it's not too late to choose differently. Thank you for loving my daughter enough to set her free. I don't love Clara, Jesse said honestly. Not the way you mean, I know. But you will. She's too much like me for you not to. Elizabeth smiled through her tears. Goodbye, Jesse Hart. Live better than I did. Be braver than I was. And when you help Clara build her life, remember that some cages can only be opened from the inside. She kissed his cheek, gathered her case, and walked toward the door without looking back. Clara started to follow, but Elizabeth shook her head. Stay with your husband. Let me do this alone. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Jesse and Clara standing in the empty parlor, surrounded by the remnants of a wedding celebration and the ruins of a family built on lies. Clara wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and looked at Jesse with new resolve. We need to leave, tonight. If Mother can find the courage to walk away from 20 years of marriage, I can find the courage to walk away from this town. Your father will be furious. Let him be. He's already lost Mother. Losing me too will be his punishment for the life he stole from both of us. Clara moved to the window, looking out at the dark street. We'll take the morning stage to Miles City, then the train west from there. I have my money, my contacts, my plans. All I need is a commotion outside cut her off. Voices raised in anger, boots on the front porch, fists pounding on the door. Clara and Jesse exchanged glances, instinct warning them both that whatever was coming wasn't good. The door burst open. Sheriff Tate entered first, his face grim and apologetic. Behind him came Caleb Rourke, drunk and triumphant. And behind Caleb, a small crowd of men, including several of the town council members. And finally, bringing up the rear, Augustus Bell returned from wherever he'd gone, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. There he is, Caleb pointed at Jesse, the thief who robbed me during our fight outside the saloon. Sheriff, I want him arrested. Jesse went very still, his mind racing through possibilities. It was a lie, obviously. He'd taken nothing from Caleb. But in the chaos of that night, with so many witnesses scattered and distracted, who could prove what had or hadn't been in Caleb's pockets? Mr. Hart, Sheriff Tate said, his voice heavy with reluctance, Caleb Rourke is accusing you of theft. Says you took a money clip with $50 during your altercation outside the Silver Dollar. Do you have anything to say to that? It's a lie. Jesse kept his voice level, despite the fury building in his chest. I never took anything from him. This is revenge because I made him look foolish. That's a serious accusation, Caleb, Sheriff Tate said, turning to the younger man. You got proof? I got witnesses who saw Hart going through my pockets while I was down. Caleb's grin was vicious. And I got the fact that he's a drifter with no roots and no reason anyone should believe him over me. Jesse's eyes moved past Caleb to Mayor Bell, and understanding clicked into place. Bell stood there with calculated satisfaction on his face, and Jesse realized this had been arranged, probably in the last few hours after Bell had discovered his study disturbed, his secrets at risk of exposure. This wasn't about Caleb's wounded pride. This was Bell moving to neutralize a threat, to remove Jesse before he could share what he'd learned or help Clara escape. Clara saw it too. She stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "This is absurd. My husband is being falsely accused because Caleb is drunk and vindictive. And my father, your father," Bell interrupted coldly, "has nothing to do with this. If your husband is innocent, the law will prove it. But theft is a serious crime, Clara. Sheriff Tate has his duty to perform. Jesse didn't steal anything." Clara's voice rose. "This is a setup, and everyone here knows it." But the men with the sheriff were already moving forward, and Jesse knew that resistance would only make things worse. He looked at Clara, tried to convey reassurance he didn't feel, then held out his wrists for the handcuffs. "I didn't steal from anyone," he said clearly, meeting Sheriff Tate's eyes. "And everyone in this room knows that. But I'll go with you, Sheriff, because I trust that the truth will come out." "Course it will," Tate muttered, snapping the cuffs on. "I'm sorry about this, Hart. Politics, you understand." Jesse understood perfectly. He was being removed from the board like a chess piece that threatened the king. The question was whether Clara could escape while he was locked up, or whether Bell would move to control her too now that Elizabeth was gone. As the sheriff led him toward the door, Jesse looked back at Clara one last time. She stood in the wreckage of her wedding day, her mother's ring clutched in her hand, determination blazing in her eyes. And Jesse knew, whatever happened to him, Clara would find a way out. Elizabeth had shown her daughter how to be brave. Now it was up to Clara to use that lesson. The door closed behind them, and Jesse was led out into the night, away from the Bell house and the woman he'd promised to protect. Away from any chance of helping either Elizabeth or Clara escape the trap Bell had built for them all. But traps, Jesse reminded himself, could be picked from the inside, and he'd spent 20 years learning how to survive in impossible situations. This was just one more cage to break free from. The only question was how much it would cost him when he did. The jail cell was small, built of thick timber and iron bars, smelling of unwashed bodies and despair. Jesse sat on the narrow cot, listening to Sheriff Tate settle at his desk in the outer office. The lawman's boots scraped against the wooden floor, followed by the sound of a bottle being uncorked. Tate was drinking, which meant he was troubled by what he'd just done. Good. He should be troubled. Jesse assessed his situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been in tight spots before. The cell lock was simple, a standard design used in jails throughout the territory. The bars were solid, but the door hinges were on the inside, a design flaw that suggested the jail had been built more for show than security. And most importantly, Sheriff Tate had been careless when confiscating Jesse's belongings. His saddlebag sat on the floor outside the cell, within arm's reach if Jesse stretched through the bars. Tate had checked it for weapons, but hadn't examined it thoroughly, which meant he'd missed the silver spurs tucked in the bottom compartment, the ones Jesse's father had given him, tarnished with age but still functional. The same spurs Jesse had used to pick locks in harder times when food was scarce and desperation made thieves of honest men. "Sheriff?" Jesse called out. Tate appeared in the doorway between the cells and his office, whiskey glass in hand. "Yeah, I need my saddlebag. Got medicine in there for my stomach. Bad beef at the wedding reception." Tate hesitated, then shrugged. "Can't hurt, I suppose. You're not going anywhere tonight." He pushed the saddlebag through the bars with his boot, then retreated to his office. Jesse heard the chair creak as Tate settled back into it, heard the glass clink against the desk. After a few minutes, the lawman's breathing deepened into the regular rhythm of a man dozing while pretending to stay awake. Jesse opened the saddlebag quietly, his fingers finding the hidden compartment by touch. The spurs emerged cool and heavy in his hands, their rowels still sharp, despite years of neglect. He'd worn these as a young cowboy, back when he'd worked for Elizabeth's father and dreamed of a future that had never materialized. Now, they'd serve a different purpose, picking the lock that stood between him and keeping his promises. He knelt by the cell door, examining the lock mechanism in the dim lamplight. It was simple, a single tumbler design that could be manipulated with the right tool and enough patience. Jesse inserted the spur's rowel into the keyhole, feeling for the pins inside, his hands remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. His father had taught him this trick during a hard winter when they'd been working a ranch that had gone bankrupt. "Sometimes, son," his father had said, "a man's got to make his own doors when the ones in front of him are locked. It's not honest, but it's survival." Remember the difference, Jesse remembered. And he remembered what his father had told him next. The question isn't whether you can open a lock. It's whether you're willing to pay the price for what's on the other side. The lock clicked softly. Jesse froze, listening for any change in Tate's breathing. The sheriff's snoring continued undisturbed. Jesse eased the cell door open, wincing at every small creak of metal on metal, then slipped out into the corridor. His boots were by the front door, his hat on a peg beside them. He retrieved both silently, then paused at Tate's desk. The sheriff was truly asleep now, his head tilted back against his chair, the whiskey glass empty on the desk. Jesse could leave without Tate ever knowing until morning. But something made him stop, made him pull a piece of paper from Tate's desk and write a brief note. "Sheriff, I didn't steal from Caleb. This arrest was politics, not justice. You know it and I know it. I'm leaving because I have promises to keep. When this is over, I'll answer for picking your lock. But not for a crime I didn't commit. J.H." He left the note weighted under the whiskey glass and slipped out into the night. The town was dark and quiet, only a few windows still showing lamplight. Jesse moved through the shadows like the ghost old Ben had called him at the mill, invisible, deliberate, leaving no trace. His destination was clear, the Bell house on the hill, where Clara waited and where Bell had returned after orchestrating Jesse's arrest. But as Jesse approached the house, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The front door stood open, lamplight spilling onto the porch. Voices drifted out, Augustus Bell's harsh and angry, and another voice clear and strong and absolutely certain. Elizabeth. She hadn't left town after all. She'd come back to confront her husband. Jesse crept closer, staying in the shadows, listening to the argument unfolding inside. "You deliberately bankrupted my father." Elizabeth's voice carried fury and pain. "You manipulated circumstances to force me into marriage. Everything between us has been built on a lie. I did what was necessary to have you." Bell's words were slurred but defiant. "Your father was weak, gambling away his fortune. I simply accelerated the inevitable. You destroyed him. You destroyed my family's future so you could own me like property. I gave you everything, security, status, a beautiful home, a daughter. You gave me a prison." Elizabeth's voice cracked. "And I've been your prisoner for 20 years. Believing I made a choice when you never gave me one. But I'm done, Augustus. I'm leaving you. Tonight, tomorrow I'll file for divorce and tell everyone in this territory what you did." Jesse heard something crash, a glass or vase thrown in rage. Then Bell's voice, lower and more dangerous. "You'll do no such thing. I'll ruin you. I'll make sure no one believes you. You'll what? Destroy me the way you destroyed my father? Too late, Augustus. You already did that 20 years ago. You just made sure I didn't know it until now." Jesse moved toward the open door, his instincts screaming that the situation was escalating toward violence. Bell was drunk, cornered, facing the collapse of everything he'd built. Men like that were unpredictable, dangerous. He reached the porch just as Clara's voice joined the argument. "Father, let her go. You've done enough damage. Let her have her freedom. You," Bell's voice turned venomous, "this is your fault. You and that drifter you married. He's already escaped jail, hasn't he? Already running just like I knew he would. And you'll run too, won't you? Leave me here with nothing but ruins and scandal. You built these ruins yourself," Clara said steadily. "Jesse and I are just refusing to live in them anymore." Jesse stepped through the open door into the lamplight, his presence immediately drawing everyone's attention. Bell stood by the fireplace, his face flushed with whiskey and rage. Elizabeth stood near the staircase, her traveling case at her feet, her spine straight with determination. And Clara positioned herself between her parents, protective of her mother, defiant toward her father. Jesse. Clara's face showed relief and worry in equal measure. "How did you—" "Later." Jesse kept his eyes on Bell, reading the mayor's body language, watching for signs of imminent violence. "Sir, this needs to end peacefully. Elizabeth is leaving. Clara and I are leaving. You can let us go with dignity or what?" Bell laughed bitterly. "You'll force me. You're an escaped prisoner now, Hart. That makes you a criminal. Sheriff Tate will hunt you down, and when he catches you, you'll hang for theft and jail-breaking both. I didn't steal anything, and you know it." Jesse's voice remained calm despite the fury building in his chest. "You arranged that accusation to control the situation. But you've lost control, Bell. It's over." "It's not over until I say it's over." Bell lurched forward, his hand reaching toward the fireplace poker. "This is my house, my family, my—" Elizabeth stepped forward, placing herself directly between Bell and the poker, her voice cutting through his rage with absolute clarity. "Your family is leaving you, Augustus, because you never loved us. You collected us, and we're done being your possessions." For a long moment, everything hung in balance. Then Bell's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him as the whiskey and the weight of his losses finally caught up with him. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, and for the first time since Jesse had met him, Augustus Bell looked like what he truly was, a lonely man who'd confused control with love and power with happiness. "Get out," Bell said quietly. "All of you, get out of my house." They left quietly, gathering what little they needed. Clara retrieved her sketch journal and the small bag she'd packed days ago in anticipation of this moment. Elizabeth picked up her traveling case, her face set with determination, despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. And Jesse gathered his saddlebag, checking that everything was secure, preparing for the road ahead. Bell remained slumped in his chair, staring at nothing, a man watching his empire crumble to dust. Part of Jesse pitied him, the tragedy of a man who'd spent his whole life building something that turned out to be worthless because it was built on cruelty and lies. But mostly, Jesse felt relief that it was finally over, that they could walk away and leave Bell to face the consequences of his choices. They reached the front door just as horses thundered up the drive. Jesse's hand instinctively moved to his belt, but he had no weapon. Tate had confiscated everything when he'd made the arrest. Through the open door, Jesse saw riders dismounting, saw Caleb Rourke stumbling off his horse with a pistol in his hand, saw other men behind him, ranch hands, cronies, the kind of men who followed wherever violence led. "There!" Caleb pointed at Jesse with his free hand, his words slurring. "The thief who stole from me, and he broke out of jail. Sheriff Tate's already looking for him." Jesse positioned himself in front of Clara and Elizabeth, his mind calculating angles and distances. 6 men, all armed, all drunk or close to it. Caleb at the front, his pistol wavering but pointed generally in Jesse's direction. Behind them, more riders approaching. Jesse recognized several as members of the town council, brought along as witnesses or enforcers. Caleb. "Put the gun down." Jesse kept his voice level, unthreatening. "I didn't steal from you. This is all a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. Liar." Caleb's face was flushed, sweat gleaming on his forehead despite the cool night air. "You made a fool of me. Took my money. Married the woman who should have been mine. You think you can just walk away from all that?" "Clara was never yours," Jesse said quietly. "She made her own choice. You need to accept that and move on." "I don't need to accept anything." Caleb stepped forward, the gun now pointed directly at Jesse's chest. "My father owns half this valley. Your father-in-law there?" He gestured wildly toward the house. "He promised me Clara would be my wife. We had an arrangement, and then you came along and ruined everything." Clara stepped around Jesse, despite his attempt to keep her behind him. "There was never any arrangement, Caleb. My father may have discussed it with your father, but no one asked me. I'm not property to be traded between men making deals." "Clara, get back," Jesse started, but she ignored him. I chose Jesse because he offered me something no one else in this town ever did: freedom. The chance to make my own choices, live my own life, pursue my own dreams. You wanted a pretty wife to show off. My father wanted a respectable marriage to secure his political connections. But neither of you ever saw me as a person with my own desires and ambitions. Shut up. Caleb's hand shook worse now, the gun wavering dangerously. You think you're better than everyone because you went to some fancy school? You think you can just reject good men like they're nothing? I think I can choose who I marry, Clara said with absolute conviction. And I chose Jesse, not because of love or passion, but because he respected me enough to let me make that choice freely. Behind Caleb, one of the other riders shifted uncomfortably. Jesse recognized him as Doc Winters, and behind Doc was Sheriff Tate, just arriving on horseback. The sheriff looked exhausted and angry, probably from discovering Jesse's escape, but his face showed something else too: shame at being part of this escalating disaster. Caleb Rourke. Tate's voice boomed across the yard. Put that weapon down right now. Stay back, Sheriff! Caleb swung the gun toward Tate, then back toward Jesse. This is between me and Hart. He's a criminal. You said so yourself. I arrested him on your word that he stole from you, Tate said, dismounting and approaching slowly. But I've been thinking about that night, and I can't remember seeing any money clip on you before the fight, Caleb. In fact, I'm starting to think you made the whole thing up. I didn't. He stole. You lied. Sheriff Tate's voice hardened. You made a false accusation because your pride was wounded. That's a crime too, son. Behind Jesse, the front door opened wider. Augustus Bell emerged, swaying slightly, but his voice carrying with the authority he'd wielded for decades. Sheriff Tate is correct. Caleb, I apologize for my part in this. I allowed your father to believe there might be an arrangement regarding my daughter, but Clara was never promised to you or anyone else. This has gone too far, but you said, Caleb's face contorted with confusion and rage. You told my father. I said many things I shouldn't have, Bell admitted, and for the first time Jesse heard genuine remorse in the mayor's voice. I've spent my life manipulating situations to my advantage, making deals with people as if they were property. But I'm done with that. Clara's free to go. Elizabeth is free to go. And Mr. Hart, Bell looked directly at Jesse, you were right. I arranged your arrest because I was afraid of what you knew, what you might tell people. But keeping this secret has cost me everything that matters. I won't compound that by letting someone get shot over my mistakes. Elizabeth stepped forward then, standing beside Bell but not touching him. Augustus, tell them the truth. Tell them about the land deed, about what you did to my father. Clear Jesse's name completely. Bell flinched, but after a moment he nodded. His voice was quieter now, drained of bluster. Hart didn't steal anything from anyone. The arrest was based on a lie I encouraged because I wanted him out of the way. And if there are other accusations about my business dealings, about how I came to marry my wife, those are true as well. I'm not proud of it, but I'm done lying. The confession hung in the night air like fog. The men around Caleb began backing away, sensing the situation had changed, that their drunk companion was no longer on solid ground. Even Caleb seemed to deflate, the gun lowering slightly as reality penetrated his alcohol-fueled rage. Caleb. Jesse spoke gently now. Seeing a young man who'd been used by his father and Bell and probably others, told he deserved things he'd never earned. Put the gun down. Go home. Sleep this off. Tomorrow you can start figuring out who you want to be instead of who your father wants you to be. For a long moment, Caleb stared at Jesse, his face working through emotions, anger, humiliation, something that might have been understanding or might have been despair. Then his arm dropped, the gun pointing at the ground. Sheriff Tate moved quickly, taking the weapon from Caleb's unresisting hand. Go home, son. We'll talk about the false accusation tomorrow once everyone's sober. Caleb stumbled toward his horse, helped by one of the ranch hands. The other riders dispersed. The drama over, everyone suddenly eager to be elsewhere. Doc Winters lingered, his eyes on Jesse, making sure his friend was truly all right. Thank you, Doc, Jesse said quietly. For coming when it mattered. Couldn't let you face this alone. Doc glanced at Clara and Elizabeth. You folks need anything? Place to stay tonight? We're leaving, Elizabeth said firmly. Right now. Before anything else can go wrong. Sheriff Tate approached, looking uncomfortable. Hart, about the jailbreak? I'll answer for it when this settles, Jesse said. But not tonight. Tonight, I'm keeping my promises to these two women, even if it means I'm technically a fugitive. Tate studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I didn't see you here. Drunk Caleb Rourke caused a disturbance at the Bell House, but by the time I arrived, everyone had left. That's what my report will say. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me. Just don't come back for a while. Let things cool down. Tate tipped his hat to Clara and Elizabeth. Ladies, safe travels. He rode away, leaving them standing in the yard as the last of the riders disappeared into the darkness. Bell remained on the porch, a silhouette against the lamplight, watching his family prepare to leave him forever. Mother? Clara's voice was soft. Are you ready? Elizabeth looked back at the house one final time, at the man she'd been married to for 20 years, at the life she'd endured because she'd believed she had no choice. Then she turned away, her shoulders straightening, her voice steady. I'm ready. Let's go. 3 months had passed since that day in front of the church, when Jesse Hart had spoken the vows he'd once been too afraid to say. The autumn air in Bitter Ridge carried the scent of harvest and wood smoke, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned the color of old gold. Jesse stood on the porch of the small house he now shared with Clara, watching the sun settle behind the western hills. His saddle hung in the barn, gathering dust. He hadn't felt the urge to move on in weeks. The restlessness that had driven him from town to town for 20 years had quieted to something close to peace. Clara stepped out beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without a word, and they stood together in comfortable silence. She'd changed too, he thought. The defiance that had first drawn his attention had softened into something deeper, a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself anymore. Your mother stopped by this afternoon, Clara said finally. She brought preserves. Jesse glanced at her. Elizabeth came here. She did. Clara sipped her coffee, her eyes on the horizon. We talked for a while. Really talked. He waited, knowing she'd tell him in her own time. She told me about you too. About how young you both were, and how scared you were when her father threatened to run you out of town. Clara's voice held no judgment. She said she understood why you left, that she'd made her peace with it years ago. Jesse felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. I should have stayed and fought for her. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe you both needed to live different lives before you could find your way back here. She looked at him then, her eyes clear and honest. She's happy, Jesse. She loves my father. She told me to tell you that. He nodded slowly, letting the old guilt finally begin to fade. And what about you? He asked. Are you happy? Clara smiled, that same bold smile that had stopped his heart in the saloon. I didn't kiss you in front of the whole town to be unhappy, Cowboy. He laughed, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep. No, I suppose you didn't. Besides, she added, leaning against the porch rail, someone had to show you that staying in one place doesn't mean giving up your freedom. It just means choosing what matters most. Jesse reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and strong, calloused from the work they'd been doing together on the small piece of land they'd bought at the edge of town. It wasn't much, just enough for a few horses and a garden, but it was theirs. I saw Deputy Morris today, Jesse said. He asked if I'd consider helping him train the new horses for the Territorial Marshal's office. Said he could use a man with my experience. What did you tell him? I said I'd think about it. He squeezed her hand gently. Wanted to talk to you first. Clara's smile widened. You're learning. Slowly, he admitted. They stood together as the last light faded from the sky, and Jesse thought about all the years he'd spent running. All the towns he'd passed through, all the people he'd kept at arm's length. He'd told himself it was about freedom, about not being tied down. But the truth was simpler and harder. He'd been afraid. Afraid of staying, afraid of being known, afraid of failing someone the way he'd failed Elizabeth all those years ago. But Clara had seen through all that. She'd grabbed him by the collar and kissed him and dared him to stop running. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. "You know," Clara said quietly, "the whole town was taking bets on how long you'd last before you tried to leave. And most of them gave you 2 weeks," she grinned. "I told them they didn't know you like I did. You didn't know me at all when you made that bet." "No," she agreed. "But I knew what I saw in your eyes when you looked at my mother's cameo. I knew a man doesn't carry that kind of regret unless he's capable of real love. He just needs someone brave enough to help him find it again." Jesse pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "I'm glad you were that someone." "Me too." Inside the house, the lamp they'd left burning cast a warm glow through the window. It was a simple life they were building, nothing grand or extraordinary. But it was real and it was honest, and for the first time in 20 years, Jesse felt like he'd finally come home. "Come on," Clara said, tugging his hand. "Dinner's getting cold." He followed her inside, and as he closed the door behind them, he glanced back one more time at the empty road that led out of Bitter Ridge. Once, that road had called to him every single day. Now it was just a road, leading somewhere he no longer needed to go. In the morning, he'd tell Deputy Morris yes about the horses. He'd start building something here, something that mattered. And maybe, if he was lucky, he'd finally learn what his father had tried to teach him all those years ago. That a man's worth isn't measured by how far he travels, but by how deeply he loves the place where he chooses to stay. Sometimes, a single moment can change the entire course of a life. For Jesse Hart, it had taken a bold woman's kiss to make him realize that the life he'd been running toward was right here, waiting for him to be brave enough to claim it.